America is pumping more crude oil than any country on Earth. In 2025, the US averaged about 13.5 million barrels a day, far ahead of producers like Saudi Arabia and Russia, both around 9 million. So why does that not protect Americans from every global oil shock? Why can conflict overseas still hit gas prices, shipping costs, and even grocery bills here at home? That is where things start to feel completely backwards. The US is still importing huge volumes of crude from other countries. And at the very same time, it is also exporting massive amounts of its own crude right back out into the world. So how can all of that be true at once? First, America uses an enormous amount of oil. You can see that in everyday life. Cars, trucks, planes, freight, farms, and industry all add up fast. US crude production hit a record 13.5 million barrels a day, but total petroleum use was still around 20 million barrels a day, based on recent EIA data. So at some level, imports are already part of the picture. But that still leaves the bigger question. If America uses so much oil that it still has to import more, why is it also exporting huge volumes of its own crude? That's where the real contradiction begins. Most people hear oil and picture one thing: black liquid coming out of the ground. But a barrel of crude oil by itself is almost useless. You cannot just pour it into your car or truck. It has to be refined into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, plastics, chemicals, and all kinds of stuff modern life runs on. And not all crude is the same. Its physical properties affect how valuable it is, how easy it is to refine, and which refineries can handle it most efficiently. In simple terms, there are lighter crudes and heavier crudes. Light, sweet crude is thinner and lower in sulfur, so it is generally easier to refine. Heavy, sour crude is thicker and takes more work. And that distinction matters because most of the crude the US exports is the lighter shale oil it now produces in abundance, while a lot of the crude it still imports is heavier oil that many older American refineries were built to handle. A lot of that lighter US crude gets sold to refiners in Europe and Asia, where it tends to be a better fit and easier to turn into the kinds of fuels they want. So how did America end up in that situation? A lot of it goes back to the shale surge of the last 15 years. And that shift was not just about drilling more, it was really a technology story. For decades, US oil production had been declining. A lot of the easy conventional oil was already tapped. Then two technologies changed the game: fracking and horizontal drilling. Fracking cracks open tight rock formations. Horizontal drilling lets companies drill through those formations sideways, not just straight down. Put the two together, and suddenly huge shale fields that had been known about for years became worth producing. That is what unlocked the shale boom in the early 2000s, and what the shale boom gave America was a huge surge in light crude oil. That helped push US production to record highs and reshaped global energy markets. But it also created a problem. A big part of America's refinery system, especially along the Gulf Coast, was built long before the shale boom, around heavier crude coming from places like Canada, Mexico, Venezuela, and the Middle East. In other words, shale changed America's oil supply fast. The refinery system did not. That does not mean American refineries cannot process light crude. They can, but many of them were built to get the most value out of heavier barrels. That is where their equipment, layout, and economics work best. The US produces plenty of oil, but not always the kind its refineries are best designed for. So it exports a lot of the light crude it now produces in abundance, and imports the heavier crude many refineries are better equipped to handle. That sounds backwards, but this is really a refinery mismatch. In the oil business, having more crude is not enough if it is not the kind your refineries were built for. By this point, a lot of people are probably thinking, okay, so why not just fix the system? Why not upgrade old refineries and keep more of America's own oil at home? When you're talking about serious refinery changes, you're not talking about a cheap upgrade. You're talking about projects that can cost billions of dollars, sometimes several billion, and in some cases close to $10 billion. And that is only the first problem. This is not a quick adjustment. Refinery projects can take years, run into permitting fights, environmental reviews, and local opposition, and still end up delayed or scaled back. Then comes the business problem. These are private companies, and private companies follow the money. If a refinery overhaul would cost billions, take years, and still not clearly pay off better than the system they already have, there is not much incentive to do it. And if future oil demand looks less certain over the long term because of EVs, cleaner energy, or policy shifts, that bet gets even harder to justify. So yes, the system can be changed, but changing it is slow, risky, and expensive. And that is only half the problem. Even if the oil is here, getting it to the exact refinery that needs it is not always simple. Domestic transport has its own bottlenecks and costs, and laws like the Jones Act can make moving crude between US ports more expensive than most people realize. You can see that clearly in California. It has major refineries and huge fuel demand, but the West Coast is not very well connected to other major US refining centers like the Gulf Coast. So even when the country is producing plenty of crude, moving the right barrels to the right refinery is not always simple. So when you put it all together, the logic becomes clear. Rebuilding is expensive, the payoff is uncertain, and even moving domestic crude is not always cheap or easy. At that point, the industry often lands on the option regular people find frustrating, but the math still favors. Export the crude America produces best, and import the crude its refinery system handles best. And in many cases, that still costs less than rebuilding the whole machine. This is the point where a lot of people start talking past each other, because what people often say they want is energy independence. We produce our own oil, use our own oil, and stop relying on anybody else. And on the surface, that sounds like the strongest possible system. But in the real world, energy independence and energy security are not the same thing. Energy independence is about doing everything yourself. Energy security is about making sure your system keeps working even when the world gets messy. For the US, that means having enough domestic production, enough refining capacity, and enough reliable supply, a system that can absorb shocks without falling apart. And that brings us to something people often miss. Not all imports carry the same level of risk. A lot of Americans hear oil imports and still picture the Middle East. But today, the biggest foreign supplier of crude to the US is Canada. Canada is next door, deeply tied into the US economy, and it supplies a lot of the heavier crude that fits the refinery system America already has. So when the US imports crude from Canada while exporting some of its own lighter crude, that is not necessarily a sign the system is broken. In many ways, that is the system working the way it was built to work. The real goal is not perfect isolation, it is resilience. And by that standard, the United States is in a much stronger position than it was during the oil shocks of the 1970s. But that still leaves one big question. If the system is more secure, why do prices still jump so fast whenever the world gets tense? This is the part that frustrates people the most. America can be in a much stronger energy position than it used to be and still get hit by rising prices. Because energy security helps protect supply. It does not lock in cheap prices. Oil is still traded in a global market. That means the price is shaped not just by how much oil America produces, but by what traders think could happen to supply across the whole world. If traders think war, sanctions, shipping disruptions, or production cuts could tighten supply, prices can jump long before any barrel actually disappears. That's why the Middle East still matters, because in the oil market, fear moves prices long before reality does. And once oil prices move, that pressure spreads fast. Gas stations feel it, trucking feels it, airlines feel it, shipping feels it. And before long, regular people feel it through fuel, delivery costs, groceries, and everyday expenses. So the key point is this. America's stronger energy position helps reduce the risk of physical shortage. It does not make the country immune to global pricing. That is why the system can be more secure than it used to be, while still feeling expensive and unstable whenever the world gets tense. So now you know why this feels so confusing in real life. America can be producing record oil, and regular people can still feel squeezed anyway. So I want to hear from you. When this system gets more expensive, where do you feel it first? At the gas pump, at the grocery store, in delivery costs, or somewhere else in your monthly budget? Drop it in the comments. And if this helped make a messy topic finally make sense, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.